The crack of thunder shook the small cabin as Sarah Nichols flinched, her husband's raised hand casting a long shadow across the wall, but the blow never came. In that terrifying moment, when William's rage had reached its peak, a strong hand appeared from behind, gripping his wrist with iron determination. "No more," came the low, steady voice of Thomas Calloway, a cowboy who had sought shelter from the approaching storm and stumbled upon a nightmare within. "You won't lay another hand on this woman." Arizona Territory, 1878. Sarah Nichols had married William at 19, full of hope and innocent dreams. 3 years later, those dreams had withered under the harsh reality of frontier life and her husband's increasingly volatile temper. What had begun as sharp words had evolved into shoves, then slaps, and finally closed fists that left bruises she hid beneath long sleeves even in the sweltering desert heat. William Nichols, a failed prospector whose dreams of gold had dissolved into bitterness, twisted against the stranger's grip. "This is between me and my wife, stranger. Best you move along before you find trouble." Thomas didn't loosen his grip. Rain pounded against the roof as lightning illuminated the cabin interior in flashes, revealing Sarah's terrified expression and the red mark already forming on her cheek from an earlier strike. "I found trouble the moment I walked through your door," Thomas replied, his voice calm but unyielding. "Now you have a choice. You can settle down or you can try me. But either way, you won't be hitting her again." William's eyes narrowed, rage and whiskey clouding his judgment. He lunged for the rifle propped against the wall, but Thomas was faster, shoving him back with enough force to send him sprawling across the rough wooden floor. "Sarah, gather what you need," Thomas said without taking his eyes off William. "This storm's breaking soon and we'll be leaving when it does." "She's not going anywhere," William roared, struggling to his feet. Sarah hesitated, years of fear warring with the sudden prospect of escape. "I can't just—" "You can," Thomas interrupted gently. "And you will, unless you're wanting to wait for him to finish what he started here tonight." The decision crystallized in Sarah's eyes. She moved quickly, gathering essentials into a small cloth bag while Thomas kept William at bay. When William tried to lunge at her, Thomas stepped between them, his hand resting meaningfully on the revolver at his hip. "Don't make me do something we'll both regret," he warned. An hour later, the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a freshly washed world and the earthy scent of wet desert soil. Thomas helped Sarah onto his second horse, a sturdy mare he'd been planning to sell in Tucson. "We need to make distance before dawn," he explained as they rode away from the cabin, Sarah casting one last glance at the only home she'd known since coming west. "He'll be after us when he sobers up." Sarah gripped the reins tightly. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Thomas was silent for a long moment, his face shadowed beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Some things a man can't stand by and watch. My pa raised me better than that." They rode through the night, stars emerging as the clouds cleared, the Milky Way stretching across the vast Arizona sky. By dawn, they reached a small trading post where Thomas had friends. The elderly couple who ran it, Jacob and Martha Winters, took one look at Sarah's bruised face and welcomed her without question. "You can stay in the back room," Martha said, leading Sarah inside while Thomas cared for the horses. "No one will find you here." Sarah slept most of that day, exhaustion finally claiming her as the adrenaline faded. When she woke, she found fresh clothes laid out simple but clean and the smell of stew cooking. Thomas was seated at the table with Jacob when she emerged, both men rising when she entered. It had been so long since anyone had shown her such courtesy that tears threatened, but she blinked them back. "Where will you go?" Jacob asked as they ate. Sarah stared into her bowl. "I don't know." "I have a sister in California, but—" She hesitated. "William might look there first." "I'm heading to my ranch near Prescott," Thomas said quietly. "You'd be welcome there until you decide. It's remote enough that you'd be safe, and I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd appreciate the company." Hope and wariness battled in Sarah's expression. "Why would you do this for me?" "Because everyone deserves a chance to start over," Thomas replied, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. "And because I know what it's like to need help and have nowhere to turn." 2 days later, they departed for Thomas's ranch. The journey would take them over rugged terrain and through territory still occasionally threatened by bandits and renegade Apache bands, though the worst of those conflicts had ended years before. As they traveled, Sarah gradually revealed pieces of her story, how she'd met William back east when he'd come through her Pennsylvania town with grand tales of the frontier's opportunities. How he'd charmed her parents and swept her away to the Arizona territory with promises of adventure and prosperity. How the gold hadn't materialized and William's disappointment had curdled into resentment, then violence. "The first time he hit me," she said quietly one evening as they camped beneath a rocky overhang, "I told myself it was the whiskey. The second time, I told myself it was my fault for burning supper. By the 10th time, I'd stopped making excuses but couldn't see a way out." Thomas listened without judgment, occasionally adding wood to their small fire. "My mother stayed with my father through similar treatment," he finally said. "Until the night he beat her so badly she lost the baby she was carrying, my little sister who never drew breath." Sarah's hand instinctively went to her own flat stomach. "I'm sorry." She left then, took me with her. "I was 12. We made it to my uncle's ranch in Texas, started over." His jaw tightened. "When I heard my father had died in a bar fight 2 years later, I felt nothing but relief." They were attacked the next day by 3 desperate men, not professional bandits, but failed miners turned to robbery. Thomas's quick reflexes saved them. He shot one man and drove the others off, but not before taking a bullet that grazed his side. That night, as Sarah cleaned and bandaged his wound, her fingers gentle against his skin, something shifted between them. Not romance, it was too soon, the wounds too fresh, but understanding, perhaps, trust. "You're good at this," Thomas commented as she tied off the bandage. "My father was a doctor," she replied. "He taught me some before." She trailed off. "Before I left with William." Thomas's ranch came into view 4 days later, a modest but well-maintained property nestled in a valley with mountains rising behind it. Cattle dotted the surrounding grassland, and a creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, genuinely surprised. Most ranches she'd seen in the territory were rough affairs, but this one showed care and planning. "Been working it 5 years now," Thomas explained with quiet pride. "Started with 20 head of cattle, and this land nobody wanted because the water was seasonal. Dug a proper well, built the house myself, Mrs. Rodriguez, a widow in her 50s whose son worked as Thomas's foreman, welcomed Sarah with warmth and an assessing gaze that missed nothing. Within hours, she had Sarah settled in a small but comfortable bedroom and had drawn her into helping prepare dinner not as a servant, but as a way to keep her mind occupied. "The señor, he is a good man," Mrs. Rodriguez said as they kneaded bread dough side by side. "Rare in these parts." "I've noticed," Sarah replied cautiously. "He will not harm you," the older woman continued, reading Sarah's lingering wariness. "But also, he will not rush you. This is good." Over the following weeks, Sarah began to find her footing. The nightmares still came, dreams where William found her, where Thomas hadn't arrived in time, but the daylight hours brought increasing moments of peace. She helped Mrs. Rodriguez with the household tasks, discovered she had a talent for the garden the older woman had been struggling to maintain, and even began riding again on a gentle mare Thomas set aside for her use. Thomas himself was often busy with ranch work, but in the evenings, they would sit on the porch and talk. He told her of his plans to expand the herd, of the books he ordered from back east, of his hopes to one day build a proper school for the children of his workers. She shared memories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her love of music, her abandoned dreams of becoming a teacher. Spring turned to summer. Sarah's bruises faded completely, though she still startled at loud noises and apologized too quickly for small mistakes. But more and more, her genuine laugh could be heard around the ranch, and Thomas found himself working near the house whenever possible, just for the chance to hear it. One evening in late July, as they watched a spectacular sunset paint the western sky, Thomas cleared his throat. "I received word today that your husband was killed in a saloon fight in Tucson last month," he said quietly. "I thought you should know." Sarah sat perfectly still, emotions crossing her face too quickly to read. "How do you feel about that?" Thomas asked when she remained silent. "Relieved," she admitted, then looked ashamed. "That makes me terrible, doesn't it?" "No," Thomas said firmly. "It makes you human." That night, Sarah cried not for William, but for the young woman she had been, for the dreams that had died, for the years lost. And when morning came, she felt lighter somehow, as if chains she hadn't fully acknowledged had finally fallen away. In August, catastrophe struck when a flash flood swept through the valley, destroying fences and drowning several cattle. Thomas and his men worked frantically to save the herd, while Sarah and Mrs. Rodriguez prepared food and tended to injuries. When Thomas finally returned to the house, mud-caked and exhausted after 30 hours without sleep, Sarah met him with hot coffee and clean clothes. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "You've become indispensable here, you know." Something in his tone made her look up sharply, but his expression revealed nothing beyond tiredness as he took the coffee and disappeared to clean up. That evening, while Thomas slept, Sarah overheard two of the ranch hands talking about a man who had been asking questions in town, a man matching William's description. Her heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. Thomas had been mistaken. William was alive and looking for her. When she told Thomas the next morning, his expression hardened. "Stay close to the house. I'll ride into town and find out what's happening." He returned that night, grim-faced. "It's him all right. The report of his death was mistaken. It was another man in his coat. He's been trailing us since we left your cabin, following rumors and asking questions." Terror flooded Sarah's veins. "He'll kill us both." Thomas shook his head. "I won't let that happen, but you need to decide what you want, Sarah. If you want to go back to him, no." The force of her response surprised them both. "Never. Then we'll deal with him," Thomas said simply. "Together." They prepared for William's arrival, knowing it was only a matter of time. Thomas sent Mrs. Rodriguez and most of the ranch hands to a neighboring property, leaving only his most trusted foreman, Miguel, and two other men. Sarah refused to leave, despite Thomas's urging. "If I keep running, I'll never stop," she said, loading the shotgun Thomas had taught her to use. "I need to face him." William arrived at dawn 3 days later, riding up to the ranch house alone but carrying a rifle across his saddle. Thomas met him in the yard, standing casually on the porch while Sarah remained inside, the shotgun ready. "Nichols," Thomas greeted him without warmth. "You're a long way from home." William's face was thinner than Sarah remembered, his eyes harder. "I've come for my wife. She belongs to me by law and by God." "She's not property," Thomas replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "And she's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." William's laugh was ugly. "So that's how it is. You stole her away to warm your bed." Should have known she'd spread her legs, for the rest of his words were lost, as Thomas moved with startling speed, closing the distance between them before William could raise his rifle. His fist connected with William's jaw, sending him sprawling in the dust. "You don't talk about her that way," Thomas said, standing over him. "Not ever." William spat blood and reached for the pistol at his hip. Before he could draw, the shotgun blast shattered the morning silence, kicking up dirt inches from his hand. Sarah stood in the doorway, the barrel still smoking. "The next one won't miss," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. William froze, looking between them. For the first time, uncertainty replaced rage in his expression. "Sarah, come home. I'll forgive this mistake. Things will be different." "Things are already different," she replied. "I'm different. I'm not afraid of you anymore, William. The law says you're my wife." "The law also says assault is a crime," Thomas interjected. "I've documented every bruise on her body when I found you beating her. The sheriff in Prescott has my sworn statement, as does the territorial judge." William's face twisted. "You can't prove anything." "I don't need to," Thomas said calmly. "I just need the doubt in their minds to be strong enough that, when your body is found, they'll wonder if you forced my hand." The threat hung in the air between them. William looked from Thomas to Sarah, seeing resolution in both their faces. Something in him seemed to collapse, the desperate anger giving way to defeat. "You were never worth this trouble anyway," he muttered, climbing unsteadily to his feet. "Keep the whore." Thomas's control snapped. This time when his fist connected with William's face, it was with all the righteous fury he'd been containing for months. William went down hard and Thomas stood over him, breathing heavily. "Get on your horse," he said when William stirred. "Ride out and don't ever let me see your face again, because the next time I won't stop with one punch." William mounted awkwardly, blood streaming from his nose. He looked at Sarah one last time, opened his mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode away. Sarah watched until he disappeared over the ridge, the shotgun still clutched in her hands. Only when he was completely out of sight did she lower it, her knees suddenly weak. Thomas was beside her instantly, his arm supporting her as they went back inside. "He's gone," Thomas said, taking the shotgun gently from her hands, "and he won't be back." "How can you be sure?" Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Because men like that are cowards at heart. He knows now that you're not alone, that you'll fight back." Thomas hesitated. "And because I'll be filing papers in Prescott next week, the sheriff owes me a favor. William Nichols will find there's a warrant for his arrest if he sets foot in this territory again." The reality that it was truly over washed over Sarah in waves. Relief, disbelief, and finally, a tentative joy. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." That night, as they sat on the porch watching lightning flicker over distant mountains so similar to the night they'd met, Thomas turned to her. "You're free now," he said quietly. "Free to go anywhere, do anything. Your sister in California or back east to Pennsylvania if you want." Sarah studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the careful neutrality in his expression that didn't quite hide the hope and fear beneath. "What if I want to stay?" she asked softly. His eyes met hers. "Then you'd make me the happiest man in the territory." "But only if it's what you truly want, Sarah, not from obligation or gratitude." She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing his. "When I was a girl, I dreamed of a love that was gentle and strong. I thought I'd found it with William, but I was wrong." Her voice gained confidence. "With you, I feel safe, not just protected, but valued, seen." Thomas turned his hand to clasp hers. "I've been falling in love with you since I heard you laugh at Mrs. Rodriguez's jokes, since I saw you plant that garden, since you stood tall this morning with that shotgun reclaiming yourself." The distance between them closed slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When their lips finally met, it was gentle a question, not a demand. Sarah answered by leaning into the kiss, her hand rising to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. They were married that autumn in Prescott, a small ceremony attended by the ranch hands and a few friends. Sarah wore a blue dress ordered from San Francisco, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Thomas couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him, his customary reserve melting into naked adoration. In the years that followed, the ranch prospered. Sarah opened the school Thomas had dreamed of, teaching not only the ranch children but also those from neighboring properties. Her sister came from California for an extended visit and ended up staying, marrying Miguel the foreman in a celebration that lasted 3 days. Their first child, a daughter, was born on a spring morning when the wildflowers carpeted the valley. They named her Hope, for what they had found in each other. Their son followed 2 years later, strong and steady like his father. On their 5th anniversary, Thomas gave Sarah the deed to the ranch, both their names inscribed as equal owners. "This was always as much your building as mine," he told her. "You remade it, just as you remade me." Sarah thought often of that thunderous night when fate had brought Thomas to her cabin door, when his hand had caught William's wrist and changed the course of her life. What had seemed like the darkest moment had become the first step toward light. One evening, as they sat on their expanded porch watching their children play in the yard, Sarah leaned against Thomas's shoulder. "Do you ever regret it, getting involved that night?" Thomas looked down at her, the years having added a few lines to his face but none to his devotion. "Not for a single moment," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Some things a man can't stand by and watch, and some chances a man can't let pass him by." As the sun set over their home, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors that had welcomed them to this land together, Sarah silently thanked whatever providence had brought this man to her door on that stormy night. The life they had built wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, disagreements, hard times when drought or illness tested them, but it was real, and it was theirs, built on respect and love rather than fear. And whenever thunder rolled across the valley, Sarah no longer flinched. Instead, she smiled, remembering how sometimes the fiercest storms brought the greatest blessings, and how courage often came not in grand gestures, but in simple words spoken with conviction. No more.